Hello and welcome to our Holy Week virtual retreat. My name is Father Jim McGuinn and I'm the rector here at the Malvern Retreat House in Malvern, Pennsylvania. And if you have been accompanying us throughout the Holy Week virtual retreat, welcome back. If this is your first time, thanks for joining us. What we've been doing each day is looking at the great readings that we hear in the liturgies during Holy Week. And we started with the readings from Palm Sunday, and we're going to end with the Gospel on Easter Sunday. Today we have 3 sessions, in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening, and we're going to be looking at the Gospel of St. John that we hear on Good Friday. It's St. John's version of the Passion. What we'd like to do for each one of these sessions is to begin by just reminding ourselves we're in God's presence, kind of settling into wherever we are. And one of the ways that we can do that is by listening to some of the great songs that we often sing on Good Friday. So I'm going to do that now. I would just ask you to remind yourself that you're in God's presence. Maybe take a couple of deep breaths just to relax, settle into your chair, and just listen to this song. Behold, behold, the wood of the cross, on which is hung our salvation. On which is hung This is one of the Bibles that I have, and you can see how long a Bible is, divided between the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the New Testament, these pages represent the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the four Gospels are just a small part of the New Testament. We've been looking at the readings for Holy Week, and what I'd like to do is just explain quickly how we got the Gospels. You know, sometimes people think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John sat down at a table and an angel of God spoke directly into their ear. They took out their quill and they started writing the Gospels. And 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 hours later, we had the four Gospels. That's called the dictation theory. As if God just dictated into their ear and they wrote it, and that's how we got them. That is not the way the Catholic Church teaches that we got the Gospels. The Catholic Church says the Gospels came to us in 3 stages. So the first stage is the actual life of Jesus Christ. His life, his mission, his death, and his resurrection. So that's the historical stage. The second stage of gospel formation is when the apostles and the early disciples went all over the known world and started to tell people about Jesus Christ. They were missionaries and they were preachers, and they would tell people the great things that Jesus did in his life. This is called the oral stage. It's the preaching of the gospel. And this stage is very, very important because the life of Jesus Christ is going to be shaped in this stage in order to meet the needs of those people that the early missionaries were sharing the good news with. The last stage is when 4 people, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and maybe their assistants, actually wrote down the gospel. This is called the written stage. So the church says there's 3 stages, they overlap, and they influence one another. The historical stage, the oral stage, and then the written stage. Because of these different stages, we have different accounts of Jesus' life and his death. In the Gospels, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They all teach us about the passion of Jesus Christ, and although it's very similar, in each one of the accounts, there are some differences. We are going to be looking at St. John's account of the passion, and I will be sharing with you some of the differences in St. John's version. Just a reminder that the Gospel of St. John is available on the Malvern website under the Holy Week Virtual Retreat. You can download that as a PDF and then print it out. So this is John's version. Jesus went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to where there was a garden, into which he and his disciples entered. Judas, his betrayer, also knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas got a band of soldiers and guards from the chief priests and the Pharisees and went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Several days ago we had a full moon. It's called the Rose Moon, and Passover is always determined by a full moon. So when Jesus leaves the upper room to go out to the Garden of Gethsemane, there's a full moon in the sky. And Jesus had to walk through the Kidron Valley, which also had a cemetery in it. So it's kind of an eerie setting. Jesus going out to pray, walking through a cemetery and seeing the full moon. When When Jesus gets to the garden, we're told that Judas is coming out as well, his betrayer. And this is an example of St. John's symbolism and his irony. Earlier in the Gospel, Jesus has said, "I am the light of the world." But now Judas is coming out with lanterns and torches with his accomplices because they are walking in darkness. They've rejected the light and need to bring lanterns and torches. They're also bringing weapons, which reminds us of the violence that's going to happen. Jesus, knowing everything that was going to happen to him, went out and said to them, "Whom are you looking for?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." He said to them, "I am." Judas's betrayer was also with them. When he said to them, "I am," they turned away and fell to the ground. The sacred name of God in the Old Testament is Yahweh, and Yahweh is translated into English as "I am who am." So when Jesus is asked, "Are you Jesus the Nazarene?" he says, "I am." And Jesus is appropriating to himself the divine name. So he says, "I am," and they fall to the ground. Remember, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's Jesus who falls to the ground in his agony as he prays. In John's Gospel, Jesus is very different. He's in control of the situation. He calmly approaches those who've come to arrest him, says, "I am," and they fall to the ground. So he said again to them, "Whom are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus the Nazarene." He answered, "I told you I am. So if you are looking for me, let these men go." This was to fulfill what he had said, "I have not lost any of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its scabbard. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father gave me?" So as I said earlier, we now know the name of the servant, Malchus, and that it's his right ear that's cut off, and that Peter does this. These are the details that we find only in John's version. This was probably included because it was a teaching on how the early church should deal with violence, especially when they were being persecuted, and when people literally came to arrest them. Jesus tells Peter to put away his sword and that he must drink from the cup. So this is Jesus probably saying to the early church that if you are arrested, it's probably best not to resist, but to give in, even for the sake of martyrdom. So the band of soldiers, the tribune, and the Jewish guards seized Jesus, bound him, and brought him to Annas first. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had counseled the Jews that it was better that one man should die rather than the people. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Now, the other disciple was known to the high priest, and he entered the courtyard of the high priest with Jesus. Then Peter stood outside at the gate. So the other disciple, the acquaintance of the high priest, went over and spoke to the gatekeeper and brought Peter in. Then the maid who was there said to Peter, "You are not one of that man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." So a few things here. You're going to hear throughout the reading of John's account the phrase, the Jews. So John is very fond of using this phrase, and it's a symbolic phrase representing not the Jewish people, but all those people who are opposed to Jesus, especially some of the religious leaders. So, here we find out about this other disciple who will appear throughout John's Passion account. He doesn't appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And later we will find out that this is the beloved disciple. Who he is, we're not quite sure. It's interesting that Jesus has just acknowledged Peter in the garden. And now when Peter is asked, "Are you that man's disciples?" he says he doesn't even know Jesus. It kind of makes it even more poignant that just a few minutes later, Peter is disavowing even knowing Jesus and being one of his disciples. Also, where Peter is standing is very important. He's not standing with the beloved disciple. We're told he's standing off by himself with those who aren't Jesus' disciples around the charcoal fire. Next. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his doctrine. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken publicly to the world. I have always taught in a synagogue or in the temple area where all the Jews gather together. And in secret I have said nothing. Why ask me? Ask those who heard me when I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said this, one of the temple guards standing near struck Jesus and said, "Is that the way you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas had him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So, you can feel how Jesus is in control of the situation. When he's struck, he turns and questions the person who did this. Also, you'll notice that the scenes are going to be bouncing back and forth. We start in the garden, now we're inside of the Caiaphas' high priest's courtyard, then we're going to go inside and Annas appears. And we're told that Annas questions Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. In this questioning, Jesus is fearless. He doesn't back away from Annas at all. Now we're going to go back outside to the courtyard where Peter is. Now, Simon Peter was standing there keeping warm. And they said to him, "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the one whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" Again, Peter denied it. And immediately the cock crowed. So these are the last two of the three accusations against Peter. The whole idea of the garden is brought up again. And Peter denies knowing Jesus two more times. And this is really Peter's trial. See, throughout the Passion narrative in John, people think that John has Jesus being tried. Jesus is absolutely innocent. Everybody else is on trial in the account. So Peter is being accused as a witness. And 3 times he denies the truth. And Peter is going to be found guilty and the cock crows. Now remember, Jesus has made a prophecy that this is going to happen. Later on, people will mock Jesus as a prophet. and yet everything he prophesied begins to come true, even Peter's betrayal. We're going to be taking up the next part of John's Passion narrative in the afternoon session. I would encourage you, where you are, to maybe just reread the first third of John's account. Read it prayerfully and slowly, and then after you're done reading it, maybe you would just like to stay where you are and spend some quiet time in prayer. You can do that by just praying quietly by yourself or saying the rosary. Maybe you'd like to do the Chaplet of Divine Mercy, or use the guided meditation that we've provided on the website. I would encourage you, like I said, reread at least this part of John's account, and then spend some time in prayer. Thank you.